Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second lecture of Art and Politics and Narrative. Because we can't go to class or come to class for a lecture this week, then I'll be recording this lecture online and posting the video on Moodle for you to watch. Let's see. So today's topic is going to be the unconscious, and the unconscious is a Freudian concept, and I'll be using it to talk about how we apply this Freudian concept to thinking about analyzing stories. And so I want us to think about the unconscious not as necessarily as something that exists, like, we all have a psychological unconscious or something like that, but I want us to think about the unconscious as a tool of analyzing literature or narrative in general. Okay, so I'll try my best to keep this as short as I can. Hopefully we can get this in under 1 hour, but usually this is a pretty long lecture. So here's our lecture schedule. So first thing I want to do is I want to do some recap of what we talked about last week with regards to literary criticism and narrative structure. And then we'll talk about Nietzsche and perspectivism. Okay, it's important to talk about perspectivism when it comes to analyzing stories, because it really depends on the viewpoint that you use to look at it. And so Nietzsche is one of the first to be willing to say, hey, what you believe to be true or your interpretation is dependent upon the perspective that you use to analyze this narrative. So it's not necessarily what is the right interpretation or what is the true interpretation, but instead, what is the perspective that you use to analyze the interpretation? Originally, we had planned on assigning groups for our presentations for this semester, but we might not be able to do that. So I don't know what we're going to do in that sense, okay? After that, we'll talk about Freud and the unconscious, and specifically psychoanalysis as a mode of interpretation. And we'll talk about one of the ways of understanding literature as a form of, work as the work of the unconscious. And lastly, we'll be doing a sort of sample analysis of your reading for this week, which is a short story from Junot Diaz's work. This Is How You Lose Her, his book of short stories, and the short story, The Cheater's Guide to Love. Okay, so we'll be talking about the character as a patient, or the writer as a patient, or maybe even the text as a sort of dream, and we'll be using it to help us understand how it is that psychoanalytic readings are how to do psychoanalysis as a form of interpretation of reading, not necessarily as a form of, interpretation of people, but a way of interpreting literature or narrative. Okay? All right, so let's begin. So to recap, last week we talked about the Oedipus myth, and specifically how there have been so many different stories written and kind of produced or generated that utilize the Oedipus myth, and there is no real set myth that we know of for sure, right? So the one that I asked you to read was Sophocles' version, of course translated into English, right? And it's a very important version of the Oedipus myth is a very important story in the Western canon because it's been used so many times to demonstrate different forms of literary criticism. So Aristotle was one of the first to kind of, I don't know if you want to say invent, but he was one of the first literary critics, and he was the first to say, when you want to analyze, whether it's a drama or a tragedy or a particular type of play or performance, you can think of it as there are different categories. And he would say that, you can look at the different categories and different parts that go into these categories and use those to analyze the text, right? So when on a very, very basic level, you can think of the story may be a type of story. Like you could say it's a genre. So today we might say that horror is a type of story or a type of filmmaking, or, and then every horror story must have certain kind of parts to it. You might have, the plot, or you might have the certain type of character. You might have the certain type of events, like the horrific event or something like that. And it depends upon the type of category. So Aristotle was the first to say that there are different types of categories of stories, and what makes up this kind of category are these different kinds of parts. Okay, so here's a short list of some of the parts that Aristotle uses. People call this kind of like a poetics, where you're analyzing how the kind of story is constructed using certain types of parts. Okay, and then you can analyze that story as acting as part of a category of stories. Okay, so what Aristotle's doing with this type of categorization and labeling is literary criticism, when we think about it in terms of like the Oedipus myth, but it's also a way of thinking, where in order to analyze something, you would break it down into this object or this thing is part of a category of something. Like, a tree is a type of plant, and trees, there are many kinds of trees, and all trees have these kinds of parts, like they have leaves or they have et cetera, right? So you can think of it as a sort of, one way I've seen it phrased is a sort of algorithm for analyzing something. You break it into its parts and you say what type of category it belongs to. Okay, so that's also a way of analyzing stories. You can say that this story is a type of story, and it has and it fits into this particular category, and it has these kinds of parts. One very, very basic way to think about a structure of a story, right, that has parts is that every story, if we're going to call it a story as opposed to just events, has a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? So the category of story has this structure, beginning, middle, and end. Okay? That's a very, very basic understanding. All right. So when it comes to the Oedipus myth, then, like I was saying, is there have been many different analyses of and interpretations of the Oedipus myth and what it means. So its sort of significance. And Aristotle said that it was a type of tragedy. Okay, and he said that tragedy has to consist of certain types of parts. Now, for our kind of for us, I'm not asking that you understand all the different, particularities of this category that Aristotle uses. What I really want you to understand is Aristotle's way of thinking about stories and how they work. He says that stories need to have certain things like catharsis, which is the purgation or the purification, right? The cathartic moment where revelation, occurs, okay? Now, I want you to be able to think about this as a kind of progenitor or a precursor to some types of analysis that we do when it comes to interpretation today, of a story, right? So, for example, let's go back to the horror story, right? Or people like to talk about detective stories. A detective story has to have the setup where, how does this occur? How do you get introduced to the crime? And then how does it get revealed? Analyzing these kinds of moments and how they're constructed, right, is a sort of poetics, okay? So you can say that goes back to Aristotle if you want, all right? So the Oedipus myth then, Aristotle uses tragedy as a way to analyze it. He says it's part of this category and it represents this kind of understanding. And he uses that to say that tragedy, and then from that you can extrapolate and say that tragedies function this way. So the function of tragedy, Aristotle would argue, is that they demonstrate the sort of fallibility of humanity when they try to escape their fate. So Oedipus is a sort of tragic character because his kind of situation or his circumstance is determined by the gods. So no matter what he does, the gods are going to have their way, even when he tries to go against it. So that's one particular interpretation of the Oedipus myth as a tragedy. Okay, but there are other sorts of interpretations of Oedipus, right? So another one that we talked about that's very popular with sort of Enlightenment thinking is to think about instead of as a story of the kind of power of the gods and the tragedy of fate itself, you can think of it as a sort of, and this might be the way that we think about tragedy today, but it's not how they thought about tragedy in the classical sense of the Greek or Roman sense. But tragedy as like the tragedy of an individual who is too arrogant, who has too much what they would call hubris, right? So let's write that, hubris, okay? So when I was in high school, they taught us that hubris is the way to interpret, the fallibility of Oedipus. He thought he was so smart, but he actually wasn't that smart. So there's this kind of moment of revelation, right? Where he finally realizes that it's a journey to knowledge, and he realizes, oh, I thought, okay, and it can have some sort of Christian overtones too. I thought I was so smart, but actually I was quite dumb, and I thought I was so brilliant, but actually I was wrong. So it demonstrates his sort of fallibility as an individual. Okay, and this is a very much linked to Plato's allegory of the cave, which we talked about last week as well. Which is, we all live in a cave, and we think that what we see is reality, but actually what we're seeing is shadows on the wall. Okay, and the true source of enlightenment, of light, and knowledge is the sun, which we're blocked off from. And if we actually try to look at it, we're actually not used to its true light. It's kind of purity of, and so we kind of reject it. So we kind of desire to live in the dark because we can't handle it. So Oedipus is also this kind of story, right? Where it's like the revelation of the gods was like, look, like it or not, you're going to kill your father, marry your mother. And he's like, no, I'm better than that. I don't need to know that knowledge, right? And, there's examples of him arguing with Tiresias, the blind prophet, who also represents this kind of example of enlightenment that Oedipus rejects. So here you have two examples, right, of a different type of interpretation of the Oedipus story. The first example is one where you're looking at it structurally. You're saying that, it's a type of category, which is the classical tragedy. And these different parts of it, whether that's the catharsis or whatever, are meant to demonstrate, is how the tragedy develops its power and its teaching power, right? And instead, right, like my high school kind of like understanding of the Oedipus story, was one of, actually it's a moral lesson. Right, it's a lesson of your own sort of fallibility. How when you think that you're really, really smart, you might actually be really, really dumb. You think that you're a hero and that you've rescued the kingdom when actually you killed the king and have married your mother. So these different types of interpretation depend upon the kind of way that you approach how to interpret the story. Okay, there's no what I want to emphasize here, especially if we're going to move into Nietzsche later on in this lecture, is that you shouldn't be thinking about it as what's the right interpretation. Instead, I want you to think about it as what interpretation do you get if you look at it from a certain type of perspective. So if you use a certain mode of interpretation, whether that's a sort of Aristotelian category or one of thinking about it in terms of Platonic, ideals, then you get a different type of result. You can think of every type of mode of interpretation as almost like a function, like a mathematical function. If you use this type of function on the text, then you're going to get a different kind of result. All right. So it's important to understand that every different type of methodology that you use to interpret stories will lead to a different type of result. That doesn't mean one is right or wrong. And when it comes to kind of academic work, a lot of times what we're arguing about is not necessarily what is the right interpretation, but instead what is the right, or maybe what is the most fitting or most useful way of doing interpretation. Okay? All right, so those are just two examples. Another kind of more modern day example that we have of, what originally started off as like Aristotelian category, am I saying that right? Aristotelian categories is the literary archetype. Okay, so Northrop Frye is a 20th century literary critic who came up with a lot of arguments about there are certain types of literary archetypes, recurrent images or characters or plots or themes or patterns that through its repetitions in many works across centuries takes on a universal quality. Okay, so this is a kind of structural view of stories, that all stories have certain kind of patterns. Okay, we'll be talking a lot more about this next week when we talk about the monomyth. Sorry, we'll be talking about the monomyth. Okay, and a lot of this is influenced by work of Carl Jung. Okay, and who is a contemporary of Freud. Some of these ideas originate from anthropology. I talked a little bit last week about Claude Lévi-Strauss and how he kind of argues that you can see kind of certain universal structures in the myths of different different groups. And there's arguments against that as well. Okay. Like I said before, I don't think you need to use the literary archetypes. I just want to demonstrate to you that there are different ways of interpreting. But at the same time, when you are doing your literary analysis, when you're looking for certain type of recurrent patterns that you might see in a story or in a set of stories, this is also doing that kind of work. A lot of people like to talk about film noir, right? Film noir, they'll have certain recurrent images, right? Like the shadows cast against the wall, or, certain types of imagery, but also certain types of characters. Like, you always have the femme fatale. You always have the angelic figure, right? And these would be sort of archetypes that you can use to analyze the story. All right, so back to Oedipus. How many times have we used? We've used about 15 minutes already, so I need to speed up a bit. Okay, so we have different interpretations of the Oedipus myth, right? So Plato, the Platonic kind of would be the allegory of the cave and the human knowledge. Nietzsche would argue that instead of thinking about it either this Aristotelian way as a classical tragedy, or a sort of Platonic way as a sort of allegory of human ignorance, he would say that actually, it's a way of understanding the sort of necessary sacrifice that must happen for a kingdom to renew itself. So instead of focusing on Oedipus, he's focusing on the idea that these sorts of stories are meant to demonstrate how, cities or towns or kingdoms need to be sort of renewed, and an individual must be sacrificed for that to happen. So Nietzsche does this through what he calls a genealogical analysis. So, he did. Okay. And what he does is, instead of saying, I'm going to look at this story as an example of this category, he says, actually, you can look at many of the different stories that, take part in this category, and you can see how they change through time. And so after looking at a very large set of, what he might call tragedy, including Oedipus, he would say that you can see through time that these different kind of stories, that some things change, some things stay the same. And these things that kind of stay the same allow you to kind of notice the certain pattern. So his pattern is not in the pattern of the story itself, but in the pattern of the set of stories and how they change through time. Okay? All right, so Freud then, which we're going to talk a little bit more about today, he talks about Oedipus not, and this is the kind of most famous interpretation of the Oedipus story, not as a story of human fallibility, not as a story of how kingdoms need to renew themselves, not as a story about the fates and the power of the gods and our inability to control our destiny. He said instead that the Oedipus story represents a sort of innate human characteristic of children in development, and specifically males, right? And he says that the male child at a certain age will begin to, as it's, discovering its burgeoning sexuality, will desire the mother sexually, and then want to overthrow the father, or kill the father, if you want, to possess the mother. Okay, so he's arguing that the Oedipus story and its kind of resonance throughout, Western civilization is because it speaks to a certain truth about the human condition. And he argues that all little boys have this sort of Oedipus complex. And this Oedipus complex is something that sort of lies underneath the surface of all kind of boys, I guess. All right, and that and it's only sort of this kind of desire manifests in these stories. So he's not saying that everyone is actually going to go out and kill their fathers and marry their mothers, but that there is a sort of hidden or kind of like I guess the word would be unconscious, an unconscious desire that you're not aware of, right? That still kind of finds its way to the surface. It expresses itself in the stories that you tell, and perhaps in your behavior as well. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So for Freud then, the kind of resonance of the Oedipus myth is an indicator, an expression of the existence of that kind of desire inside that maybe you don't know about, that you don't sense, right? But it still manifests itself. So Freud is the first, perhaps, I guess, I don't know if he's the first. Let's just say he's the first, okay? Just like as if because I'm teaching this, okay? But, I could be wrong. You can go look it up, okay? He's the first to say, when you look at a story, you can say that the story is not necessarily about what the story is about. Instead, the story is about something else. Okay, I know that that's an allegory, but he's saying that the allegory, right, might be about something that's a kind of inherent condition of the society that reads it, that likes the story, that consumes it, or the writers who are writing it. So then when you read the story, he's saying that you don't want to look, well, you can if you want, but he's saying that another way to read the story, interpret the story, is to interpret the story as an indicator of that hidden desire or that hidden truth. Okay, so this is very, very important when we think about, the ways that we might interpret stories, as kind of, even though it's about something, right? Like, let's say a story is about how I went to the market and, I went to the market and I was supposed to buy a can of tomatoes, but instead I bought a bottle of alcohol, and then I went home. And instead of making myself pizza, I made myself cocktails and drink. So you could say that you can interpret that as, okay, what happened? This person bought something instead of something else. But if you're doing a psychoanalytic reading, you can say that this story is really about a person who is an alcoholic and has some sort of self-destructive tendency and desire to drink and drink away his problems instead of, eating or something like that. So even though that's not the same thing as the Oedipus complex, it's saying that the story represents something or expresses something that's going on within the psyche of the character or the people who wrote it or the people who were reading it. Okay. Lastly, and I don't want to focus too much on Levi-Strauss, but he categorizes certain myth themes. He does this what he calls a structural analysis. He says that each narrative event, and this is very similar to Aristotle, can be categorized as a sort of signifier and analyze the relations between these myth themes leads to sorts of meanings. Okay, so last week I gave you a kind of a chart that you saw of how Levi-Strauss categorizes like the Oedipus myth and these different things. So remember, for Levi-Strauss, he's not analyzing on the terms of the character. He's analyzing in terms of the way that kind of groups, populations, understand, certain moral rules about living, right? So for him, the Oedipus myth is about kind of different things like incest and the prohibition against incest. So he's looking at it from a very anthropological view, and he thinks that you can look at these myths and these particular constituents of these myths that he calls myth themes, right? Like the father and the sister are close, or the son kills the father. And you can look at all these different myths and see these kinds of relationships, right? Like, I don't know, like, okay, we'll talk a little bit more about this next week, but like in Star Wars, right? Luke Skywalker, he discovers that his father actually didn't die and actually is alive and is evil, and he has to kill him. Okay? So Levi-Strauss would look at different examples of these and say that if you analyze the relationship between these different myth themes, you can see what it says about this society or this group. So, like the society that likes that watches Star Wars and thinks that the relationship between the son killing the father, but then the father rescuing the son, represents something about the society, then you could read it that way. Okay, so like I said before, none of these are necessarily the right interpretation. Instead, you should be thinking about these as different forms or different ways of interpreting, different modes of interpreting. And I'm using the Oedipus myth not because it is like correct or right, but because so many people have used it and interpreted the myth in different ways in order for you to see the different types of interpretation that can be done of a story depending upon the type of interpretive mode that you use. Okay? And they can be applied to different things, right? So Levi-Strauss is saying that you can understand something about the structure of a society by interpreting the story. Sigmund Freud is saying that you can understand something about the way someone feels on the inside, their inner desire, by analyzing the story. Nietzsche is saying you can understand something about, the ways that stories function. Okay, whereas and Plato didn't say this, but I'm saying that the Enlightenment sort of interpretation of the Oedipus myth, we're taught in high school about hubris and that kind of thing, is one about kind of the fallibility of humanity and is a sort of moral lesson. Some might say that is a sort of melodramatic interpretation. Okay, but I'm not going to go too deeply into that. But if you're interested in studying more of that, why don't you post in the forums and we can talk more about it. Okay, so let's talk about Nietzsche. So Nietzsche is one of the sort of giants of the 19th century, intellectual giants. So when you talk about the 19th century, and the people who really kind of revolutionized thinking, you would talk about Nietzsche, you would talk about Darwin, you would talk about Freud, you would talk about Marx, right? And, all the kind of different contributions that they made. Nietzsche is very famous for, let's see, or I mean, for his different writings like The Birth of Tragedy, Beyond Good and Evil, The Genealogy of Morals, The Gay Science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And he wrote in a very kind of, as he developed more as a philosopher and a thinker, he wrote in a very kind of like, what's the word they use? He wrote in aphorisms, okay? Almost like in a kind of religious text, kind of like sonnets or kind of like psalms, you know? So anyway, he was very kind of, he was a philologist, okay? So this is a sort of way of saying someone who studied languages of like classic period. And when they say classic, they mean like Greek, Roman, okay? And he was a proponent of what you could call like a radical critique of morality and traditional philosophy, and specifically Kant, okay? So he's working very much against this kind of Platonic idea that there is some fundamental truth, you know, this kind of absolute sense of things. And he's saying that everything, you know, all forms of truth that you have are contingent upon the perspective that you use to understand it. Okay, so a very easy way to think about it is like the let's see, I'll use this: elephant, blind men. Okay, so right, so let's say so this is a very famous kind of trope to think about it, right? So you have 6 blind men. Okay, make this bigger. You have 6 blind men, or whatever, okay? It's a story, okay? All of them are trying to analyze this thing. And they can say that this thing is true, okay? And this thing is an elephant. So the first guy touches the tusk, and he's like, oh, it's a spear. And that's true, right? From his limited perspective, what he's touching is a spear. Whereas this blind person on top touches the ears, and they're big, and he says it's a fan. And yeah, from his perspective, yeah, it could be a fan. Another person pushes up against the girth of the elephant, and it's so big, you know, and flat, and he's like, so it's a wall. And then another person who's against the elephant's legs, and it's so big and strong but round, it's a tree. Another person touches the elephant's nose? I forgot what it's called. Okay. And says, oh, it's a snake, you know, it's this moving, lithe, kind of like a cylindrical kind of thing. And the last person touches the tail, he's like, oh, it's a rope. Now, all 6 of these people are right from a certain perspective, but none of them are completely right, but none of them are completely wrong. So from thinking about it in terms of Nietzsche, you could say that, you know, from a sort of perspectival understanding of truth is that, you know, it's not that there's one thing that's kind of fundamentally true and you're not really capable of seeing that, because we're all linked to our perspective on things. And so the kind of argument that I want to make for the purposes of our lecture is that the perspective that you use to understand the story is the same thing as your mode of interpretation of that story. So it's not that Freud is wrong. It's not that, you know, Aristotle is wrong or whatever. It's more that they are using their particular perspective and it makes sense from that perspective. Now, for us, we can look at an elephant as a whole and say, oh yeah, you know, that's an elephant. We can see it from an entirety. But you must always think that we are always blind in certain ways. You know, even though I might say that, you know, an elephant is big, but if I were a blue whale, the blue whale would be like, well, no, elephants are small. It's tiny, right? So every kind of value judgment that you can make, whether it's that something is tall, something that is big, it's kind of dependent upon the perspective that you're looking at it from, or examining it from, or observing it from. Okay, let's see. Okay, so he applies his critique to even things like morality. He's saying that, you know, something that is, I don't know, should I read? I'll read it. Okay. So this is from On Truth and Lies in Non-Moral Sense. Concepts and language do not correspond to reality. They are not true. Okay, concepts are metaphors. It's a figure of speech that refers to one thing through representation, symbolism, analogy, allegory, etc. So he's saying if truth alone has been decisive in creating designations, how can we possibly be permitted to say the stone is hard? As if hard were something known to us in some other way, and not merely as an entirely subjective stimulus. We divide things up by gender, describing a tree as masculine and a plant as feminine. How arbitrary these translations are. How far they have flown beyond the canon of certainty. We speak of a snake. The designation captures only twisting movements, and thus equally well could apply to a worm. So his attack is on the truth that we might think comes from language. But in fact, he's a philologist, right? So he studies language, he studies translations over time. He says it's like, no, concepts change through time. What might be understood as hard to one group of people could be understood as soft to another group of people, right? And there's no truth in the language of itself. Softness itself is an arbitrary kind of idea that only kind of gets understood based upon the perspective and the context of the situation. So he's saying how arbitrarily these borders are drawn, how one-sided the preference for this or that property of a thing. When different languages are set alongside one another, it becomes clear. And so this is his methodology. Different languages set alongside one another. Okay? This is kind of comparison. It becomes clear that where words are concerned, what matters is never truth, never the full and adequate expression. Otherwise, there would not be so many languages. Okay? So, he takes this, and he runs with this idea, right, of perspectivism. And he starts off talking just about language. Eventually, he gets to these kind of big, what you might call transcendent ideas that people think are generally true, like God, right? He says, like, is God a true concept? Just because we have the concept for God, does that mean that God is actually true? Okay? I don't want to get too much into that, but that's something to read into or to study. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is no God or that there is a God. It just means that it's something that Nietzsche would argue is still contingent on the perspective that you take. Okay, that doesn't mean that it's not true or isn't true. Okay, but it does mean that you have to think about your ways of approaching it. How do you get to it? How do you get there? Okay, how do you get to that truth? Okay, so this is kind of how it comes down to. Okay, so knowledge then is contingent upon perspective. It's not that there's no knowledge; it's that knowledge is always related to something else. So without a universal perspective, right? So it's like when we look at the blind man, we say, oh, they can't see the whole elephant. But here's the thing: who can? Okay, is there such thing as a universal perspective? And who can do that? And before it would be like, oh, there's a God's perspective, but who can see that? So is there an objective reality upon which to base rules and norms? And so is it even possible to access that reality? Okay, so who gets to speak for that? So, a lot of the critique that Nietzsche has of, let's say, the traditions of the church at the time, it could be seen as an attack on God, or it can also be seen as an attack on, organized religion and the idea that someone like a pope or a pastor can speak for God, when they themselves are bound by their perspective as well. Okay? So how is it that you can access that? Okay? So he's saying that you can think about, instead of thinking about something as, and okay, let's just limit it to saying that, within the world, the confines of our world and our bounded ability to sense the world and understand it, truth is there. It's very hard to know whether there is an actual truth or not. Instead, you can think of it as a truthiness, as a, how truthful is it? And then it depends upon how much perspective you can get on that thing. Okay? So he's saying that truth then is subjective, it's not objective. There's no such thing as an objective truth. Okay? Truth is always interested. It always comes from a certain vantage point or perspective. So if you're the person who's in front of the elephant and you don't know what the elephant is, right? Your truth that the elephant's tusks or the elephant is a spear is based upon your interest, and your interest is that you are in front of the elephant and that it can damage you or something like that. So that's the knowledge that you gain. So remember, this does not mean that there's no truth, just that it's not accessible, and then that anyone who makes claims to that is ignoring the fallibility of their own perspective. So this is from The Will to Power. So insofar as the word knowledge has any meaning, the world is knowable, but it is interpretable. Otherwise, it has no meaning behind it, but countless meanings. Perspectivism. It is our needs that interpret the world, our drives, and therefore and against. For every drive is a kind of lust to rule. Each one has its perspective that it would like to compel all the other drives to accept as a norm. So this argument about perspective and kind of the interestedness of knowledge is a critique that Foucault will later pick up on and willing to say that all knowledge is power. That knowledge, power are the same thing. Okay, I won't get too much into that, but if you want, we can talk more about that in our later lectures, or you can ask about it in the forums and we can talk more about it. Okay? All right. So now let's get to Freud. Hold on. Let me take a quick drink break. So Freud, also part of that kind of Austro-Hungarian Empire, studied and practiced medicine. Okay, he lived during kind of after the rise of the Third Reich, and he escaped the Nazis and he died in exile. And he specialized in neuropathology. So Freud was one of the first to say that, actually there are damages and harms that can be done to people that are not seen, are ones that you cannot kind of visually or kind of know from a sort of sense perspective. So this experience came because he began to analyze patients like war veterans who would come back from wars, right? And they would have no physical symptoms. So even though they made it through, they didn't have lost limbs, their organs weren't damaged, but for some reason they were still kind of suffering from these kinds of things. Today we might know it as kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, or other kind of like incidences of psychological trauma. But back then, there was no way of understanding that. So who's the first to say it's like, okay, maybe we can try to understand this by talking to people, to try to understand these kind of psychological illnesses that they're going through. And he posited that there's this thing called the unconscious, right? Where even if you, let's say, for example, let's continue with the soldier. You have a soldier that comes back from war, and you ask the soldier, "Are you okay?" And the soldier says, "Yeah, I'm okay. People died, but I didn't die. People got their limb shot off. I didn't get my limb shot off. I'm healthy. There's nothing really wrong for me." And yet this soldier keeps doing these kind of very, very self-harming or harming others kind of behavior. The soldier can't sleep. The soldier drinks too much, causes all these problems or causes problems to himself. Maybe, doesn't know why, but wants to self-harm. Okay. But then when you ask the soldier what's wrong, the soldier say, "Oh, nothing's wrong. I don't know what's wrong." Right? So Freud would say that there's something going on beneath the surface. Okay, and this is very important. This kind of this concept of there being an above the surface and below the surface. Okay, so Freud would say that our minds themselves also have this kind of dynamic where there are parts of it that are at the surface. So like he would say that your cognition, what you're thinking right now, this is all accessible to you. But he would say the majority of your mind is inaccessible. It's unconscious. Okay, so he uses a lot of, I don't know if he used this originally, but people use the metaphor of an iceberg. So imagine it's an iceberg, right? Like in Titanic or whatever. Okay, now most of the iceberg is below the surface. Below the surface of the water, you can't really see it. All you really see is the top tip. But actually, there's a huge, massive mass of the iceberg below the surface that determines a lot of what happens to the iceberg. Determines its movements, its weight, its movement, right? So like with the Titanic, they didn't crash into the top part of the surface that was the top part of the iceberg that was top. They crashed into the part that was below, which was massive and ripped a giant hole in the bottom of the ship. Okay? So just like this massive part of the iceberg that's below the surface that can destroy your Titanic boat, your mind has a lot of, or Freud would argue, that your mind has quite a significant amount of it that's below the surface that you cannot access, that you don't understand. It's, non-understandable. Okay? And he splits the mind up into these three things. Okay? Now, many psychologists would not agree with these kind of designations today. Okay? The point is not that Freud was right about his particular biological analysis of the brain. It's more that he created a sort of conceptual metaphor for understanding how the brain works. Okay? So he would argue that the part that the brain or the mind, okay, and even that distinction is quite strange, right? If you break it down, but we can talk more about that some other time. Now, that the mind is made up of three parts: the superego, the ego, and the id. Okay, so the part that we most kind of feel in touch with, that we know, is the ego, that we consider the self. So if I'm like, oh, I'm Dr. Jason Koh, I am a lecturer at the University of Hong Kong, and I know this about myself. He would say that that's just this tip of the iceberg. Okay, that's just what I know. Now, the other part, a big part of it, is the superego. He would say the superego is this kind of like authoritative, kind of command, kind of oriented thing that restrains you, that represses you, that kind of controls you. Okay? So for him, it would be like the voice of your father in your head. Sometimes you could think of it as like, like let's say you have, there's always that kind of trope in like Western cartoons or whatever of like the angel and devil on shoulder. Okay? So like So let's look at this one. Okay. So imagine that there's like how do I make this bigger? So imagine that, you are an individual. And as an individual, you have a kind of angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other, right? And then you are trying to make your mind between the two of them, and they both talk to you, okay? So that's a very kind of melodramatic, kind of Western Christian moral kind of way of thinking about it. But it's just an easy kind of metaphor, easy analogy for us to understand, okay? You can think of it as like the superego as that sort of angel, okay? Like the authoritative voice that's telling you or repressing you from doing the things that you really want to do, okay? These bad things that you really want to do, okay? So for Freud then, that voice for him often was like the voice of the father. Your dad is, and I guess he grew up in a very, patriarchal household, where his dad was like, Freud, I know you want to do this, but stop it, stop. So this kind of like voice that represses you and stops you from doing things, which is a very big part of your personality, is the superego. Okay. And he would say that, a superego, and most of it is unconscious. So you don't even know that you're repressing yourself. You don't even know that the voice of your father or whatever is inside your head telling you, hey, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that, behave, blah, 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 blah. Okay? And then he would say completely below the surface. So notice this part, right? That is not accessible at all to you. That you don't even know what's going on is the id. The id is this kind of primordial desire, okay, for stuff, right? Oftentimes Freud associates it with sex drive. But, you could associate with a lot of things like hunger or, passion, okay? And this is a kind of big driver. And the superego seeks to kind of repress this part, and the ego is kind of balanced out by the superego and the id, okay? And the only part you really know is a little bit of the superego is like, yeah, I know that my mom would say don't do that, right? But, but the id is what's really kind of deep-seated down inside of you, okay? So Freud then, his kind of point was like, okay, we can't see this part, but it exists. How do we figure it out? How do we find it? How do we analyze it and understand it? And most of all, how is it that we can cure these people who are suffering from disorders that are hidden below the surface? Okay? So he's saying you have to, psychoanalysis then, right? So psychological analysis, okay, is this analysis of the sort of unconscious mind. So psychoanalysis interprets the mind and its states like a story with symbols, metaphors, images, and assumes that there are underlying motivations and biases. Okay, this is a key. Underlying motivations and biases. Okay, so like like for example, those of you who ever kind of like really got into Freud, at a young, when you're in high school, you're like, oh, everything is a phallic symbol. It's like, oh, look at, like the Titanic is a phallic symbol. The Washington Memorial is a phallic symbol. Everything is a representation of, the male sexual desire or something like that. Okay. Now that's a very kind of simplistic view of it. All right. And then today we wouldn't necessarily think of it as Freudian, but oftentimes we do these kind of psychoanalytic interpretations of things. Right. So like, let's say you're, watching a movie. Let's go back to a noir movie, okay? And in the noir movie, here's a good one, okay? Many of you have read Madame Bovary, right? And in Madame Bovary gets obsessed with this dude, and she's always like, "Oh yeah, this guy, I love this guy so much. I'm so obsessed with him." And she plays with his and she like obsesses with a cigar that he leaves behind for her. I forget the exact context, okay? And she's like so into this cigar. You can see the cigar is like a phallic symbol of her love for his like sexuality or whatever. So she's never going to outright be like, oh man, I really, really want to have sex with this guy, but she's going to like play with his cigar all day long, okay? That's like a very obvious kind of phallic symbol. But that's also a sort of psychoanalytic interpretation. Okay. Now, in the same way, we have many sort of psychoanalytic interpretations of stories that we would put out today. Okay, that have you ever kind of read a story or watched a movie or listened to someone tell a story, and notice that, you know, a certain symbol or a certain idea kept coming up, and you're like, this kind of indicates something else. Okay, so for example, right, like when people analyze people's bias, you know, and say that, oh, you know, they're actually demonstrating their unconscious bias, that this person is actually rather racist or very sexist or something like that. And they're like, how do you know that? How can you know for sure? And it's like, well, I am psychoanalyzing their words or their phrases, okay? And it kind of demonstrates to me, you know, a lot of times people talk about it in terms of like, you know, like straight versus homosexual, and this is not a binary, right? It's a spectrum of, you know, desire, you know. So like, let's say it's like someone, you know, oh, I know, like, let's say like, I want to talk to you about my friend Sigmund Freud. And I'm like, oh, Sigmund, you know, he's like one of my best friends, and he's so smart and he's so strong, you know, and all the women really, really like him. And, you know, because he's so smart and he, you know, he's so brilliant, he comes up with all this stuff, you know, like I really admire him. And, you know, I collect all of his, you know, old cigars and things like that. So I'm really like, you know, I know that on the surface, it seems like you're saying that you really like your friend Freud, but unconsciously, it sounds like, you know, you kind of have some homosexual desire for your buddy Freud there. So it's kind of like that's a psychoanalytic interpretation. Okay, that it's not just what you're saying, but what you're saying is an indicator of something that some sort of hidden desire underneath. Okay. So what does psychoanalysis assume then? It assumes that people are not entirely conscious of their irrational drives, you know, like your libido. Like you don't really recognize, you know, whatever latent desire that you might have and its effect on your behavior. So, you know, like those who come back from, you know, Freud was looking at these people with shell shock, and they weren't really aware of the effect that going to war had on them. And it was causing them to be irrational or angry and do these kind of things, you know. So, and Oedipus would also relate it to a lot of childhood development, okay? Obviously, like the Oedipus complex, right? So it's like, you know, like let's say you have a little boy who's like 4 years old, and he keeps like, you know, starting at 4 years old, suddenly he first, you know, no one really understands why, he doesn't understand himself, but he suddenly starts hitting his dad and like trying to like, you know, stop his dad from playing with his mom. You know, it's like, mommy, you know, you belong to me. I just want to play with you all the time, mommy. I don't want to play with daddy, and I don't want daddy to play with mommy. Something like that. He would say that this is an example of the sort of unconsciousness that's kind of playing out in the child's behavior. That the Oedipus complex is becoming manifest in that behavior. So this kind of unconscious is different from the subconscious, okay? I'm not a psychologist. I don't appreciate the finer points of these differentiations, okay? And I'm fairly certain that Freud was not right on a lot of these things. But think about it not necessarily as Freud was able to figure out the truth of psychology, but Freud offered a lens, a methodology for understanding psychology. And more importantly, okay, especially for us, you know, in literature and cultural studies and film studies, is not that he was offering a way to understand people, but offering a way to interpret stories as kind of expressing something else that's manifest, okay? So symptoms of the unconscious would then be like pathological compulsions, like repetitive self-destructive behavior, defense mechanisms, you know, like let's say you meet someone who's like really, really, really touchy about something, you know, and they're very, very defensive about something, even though on a normal everyday basis, it doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. I don't know. Let's say I was like a really insecure person, you know, and okay, I am, but that's not the point. And you know, like people were always like, "Oh, Jason, how come?" You know, like anytime someone talked about how like I'm bald and how I have no hair, I would get really, really upset. And be like, "Oh, you know, I'm not bald. You know, you're bald, or you know, like being bald is fine. There's nothing wrong with being bald." You know, someone might say, like, "Well, okay," and this is the way Shakespeare put it, right? When you talk about defense mechanisms, is "Thou doth protest too much," right? So it's kind of like, well, you're being so defensive about it that it's clearly something that's very sensitive to you, that unconsciously maybe you don't realize how much it's really, really bothering you, okay? So that's a symptom of the unconscious, right? Or irrationality or hysteria, you know, like some people, they have really strong anxieties about things that really might not be that big of a deal, okay? Another thing that's a symptom of the unconscious, and this is part of the superego, is repression. So the superego is like so strong, right? It's like, no, you cannot have these feelings. So let's say you come from a person, an individual, comes from a very strict household that where being a good child means that you never have certain kinds of desires or certain types of emotions. And if you do have those kinds of desires or those emotions, then it demonstrates that you are a shame to the family or that you are bad in some sort of way. So then there would be a sort of, and if this has been drilled into you, Freud might argue that the superego inside of you is going to repress those desires. So like, let's say, my whole life I grew up and my family told me that it's really 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 bad to wear the color red or the color white, I don't know, whatever, okay? And if you do that, then you're evil, then you're bad, and that you'll be kicked out of the family. Well, then I might have a very strong repression of that. But then let's say deep down inside my id, I have I really really want to wear yellow, I really really want to wear white. I would feel really, really bad about that. So I will suppress that out of my mind, okay? And he would say that just like a sort of volcano, right? The more you repress it, the stronger it gets until one day it just blows up, right? And I just go out and I go on a shopping spree and I buy an entire wardrobe of yellow clothes. Whatever, okay? All right, so obviously he's talking about things much more serious than my fashion choices. But what he's saying is that, there's sometimes this repression of certain things, and for me, that this is here. Let me see where I'm going to get to this. Yeah. One is this idea of childhood sexual abuse. Okay, so now I'm going to insert a trigger warning. Okay, so those of you who are not comfortable with talking about things like childhood sexual abuse and that kind of thing, then it's okay if you want to turn off the lecture now. Okay. But it is the topic that we're going to kind of move into slowly as we talk more about Junot Diaz's work. Okay. Okay, so we're already on 50 minutes. All right. So a lot of times Freud and many psychologists would say that there's a sort of self-suppression. Like let's say that someone might have been abused sexually by someone when they're a child. And as a child, you don't really understand what's happening. And at the same time, this person that does this terrible thing might be a trusted authority figure of some sort. So you might, or that person who is the victim might find themselves begin to repress those memories because it would be too painful to acknowledge that, or it would violate something that they understand, like that person loves them, or that person is important to them, or a valuable person to them. Okay, so there's a sort of self-suppression that can happen too. Okay, and that's really difficult. All right, so here's an example of the Freudian slip. The Freudian slip, like the kind of joke, right? So a Freudian slip is kind of when you say something and you mean another. So in this joke, here's Freud on a couch. He's like, a Freudian slip is when you say one thing, but you mean your mother. I mean another, right? And then you had this kind of funny image of him like, what did I just say? What did I mean, right? So like the joke about Freud is that he's just obsessed with moms, right? And so it's like, like let's say it's like, I don't know. It's very hard to come up with a Freudian slip, off the tip of your tongue. So you can come up with your own Freudian slips, okay? All right, cool. All right. So the theory of the Oedipus complex, right? And so this is okay. So this is Freud's interpretation of the Oedipus story. And it is also his interpretation of kind of human desire, especially young male childhood desire. And he creates this kind of concept. He says these are his findings using this mode of interpretation, which is psychoanalysis. So remember, what I want you to learn is not necessarily that Freud was right and that there's such thing as Oedipus complex. It's more that Freud created a way of thinking about stories, a way of analyzing them. Now, we can disagree with his findings, but still think that his mode of analysis is quite interesting. Just like, maybe there was an astronomer who invented the telescope. Okay, and I know that this is true. I just forget their names, okay? And he looked through the telescope, and he was like, oh, I looked through the telescope, and it looks to me like, the sun revolves around the Earth. Now, actually, he was wrong, right? He looked at it wrong, but we can still use the telescope. And we can look through the telescope and look at it more and create even better telescopes, more refined telescopes, in order to see actually that the Earth revolves around the sun and that the Earth belongs to a solar system that's revolving around a galaxy, and so on and so forth. Okay, as your telescopes become stronger, more refined, more focused. In the same way, I want you to think about interpretation. You could use a psychoanalytic interpretation, but you don't necessarily have to agree with the findings that others have used from their psychoanalytic interpretation. Okay, so this is his findings, right? That there's this Oedipus complex that exists in all little boys. which is that the male child desires the mother sexually, okay? And it's a manifestation of the id, the libido, okay? But the father stands in the way, and this represents an enforcement of law against incest, okay? So it's a manifestation of the superego. So he thinks it has a very strong explanatory kind of explanatory power, and that it explains why is it that children rebel against authority when they're young, okay? Now, there's an argument to be made, and this was in the Norton, and I thought it was quite interesting. I want to bring this up, especially when it comes to our understanding of the Junot Diaz readings. Okay, and that's that there was a time where Freud wasn't really entirely sure about the Oedipus complex, and there was a time where he thought that maybe these kind of childhood manifestations of these kind of anxiety disorders, he didn't call them anxiety disorders back then. And he noticed that many female patients suffering from what he called hysteria reported these kind of childhood sexual abuse by their fathers. Okay, what back then was called the seduction theory. We wouldn't call that seduction today, right? But we call it molestation or sexual abuse. And he said that many of them turned out to be fantasies or that they were unverifiable. And that, but if you think about it, this kind of idea that a lot of childhood development problems and adult problems that manifest because of problems or things that happen during childhood actually could be because of this kind of trauma that happens in youth. Okay, it's actually a quite I would say, well, like I said, I'm not a psychologist, but okay, just from the basic stuff that I read, a lot of people would say that kids who go through childhood sexual abuse have a lot of deal with a lot of psychological kind of issues as they grow older. And this is an example of, how, these kind of things can be repressed and, unless they get worked through, it can cause lasting damage. And it's a sort of trauma that's beneath the surface. Okay. However, after Freud's father died, he stopped focusing on this idea of the abuse to his daughter. And he started focusing more on this kind of the idea of the son who desired the mother from the guilty father. So there's this kind of argument that Freud, after a certain time, when his father passed away, he felt really bad about that. And instead he thought, okay, maybe that the truth is more about, how fathers and their sons don't get along. And he made that the centerpiece of his arguments about childhood development. And he made the Oedipus complex the centerpiece of his kind of findings about psychology. Whereas, in fact, maybe he was more onto something that was stronger, which is that a lot of times psychological disorders stem from childhood sexual abuse. But anyway, that's just a very modern day interpretation. So what are the critiques of Freudian theory? Well, there are many, as you might know already, right? So, he would argue that, this Oedipus complex is responsible for everything that we see. Everything that we understand is a manifestation of the kind of tension between the id and the superego fighting against each other. Okay, so he argues this in Civilization and its Discontents. And when you have a theory of everything, it doesn't really explain anything at all. Okay, so that's a big problem. Another problem with his kind of theories is that, that it's very sexist. It's very kind of male-centric, male-focused. It doesn't think about gender as a spectrum. It doesn't think about sexuality as a spectrum. It assumes a very Western nuclear family, right? Like, okay, for example, the majority of people in the world, especially before the European, age, right, and our present situation, middle of post-globalization, whatever you want to call it, did not live a nuclear family. Okay, this idea that you have a mommy, a daddy, and a children or child, this nuclear family was not how people grew up. People grew up in villages. People grew up with, adults and children running around, and this kind of strict sense that you only hang out with your mom and your dad, where most people are raised maybe by their grandparents or the aunties or the uncles, and you live in these kind of big communities. Okay, so how is it that you can have something that's primarily focused on a father and a mother and a child, this kind of nuclear unit? It doesn't really make sense, and it's not applicable to anything other than maybe Freud's Victorian society in, Vienna or whatever. And it's very, very structural. So it's kind of like, how can this be the only way when instead of thinking about it as, this particular category of people do these kinds of things, maybe it's much more liquid or much more fluid than that. It's very overdetermined, right? It relies on this kind of master narrative. So here's the thing we're going to be talking about as the semester continues. We're talking about more of the kind of master narratives and this idea that you have one set solid interpretation, right? And that's the master narrative. And actually, there could be a lot of critiques of that. Another thing is that it's sort of misanthropic. It's kind of anti-people. Why is it that the thing that you fundamentally think is true of all people is something that's very, very, I don't know, negative, you might say. Okay, like wanting to kill your dad and have sex with your mom. Okay, and also it sees desire as a form of lack. Okay, his argument would be that desire is always like desire for something. I desire this. Whereas desire can be seen as something that's productive. Instead of I desire this desire itself generates the this. Okay, this is quite complicated. We can talk more about this in a later lecture if you like. But this is something that specifically Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari critique in their work, The Anti-Oedipus. And it's very much against this idea that only this singular thing can be the thing that desire is for something, whereas opposed to, you can think of desire as generative, as productive. Itself not seeing as something that is missing, but itself that creates things. Okay, I know it's quite complicated, so we can get into that some other time. So why is it that psychoanalysis is important to our literary analysis, right? He's talking about people. Okay, hold on, let me have it. Okay, so why is it important to literary analysis? So for him, then, and he was the first to say that dreams can be interpreted for the unconscious. So he said that dreams, which is like if you try to interpret a dream, you're trying to say that the dream is a story that has meaning, right? You're looking for illusions, signifiers, metaphors. So he says that stories can mean more than just what is stated by the text. Dreams and stories are more than just wish fulfillment or fantasy. They could be representations of, desires, of repressions, and they're kind of a rich kind of archive for you to analyze and to try to understand what lies beneath. Okay, so then he says, in the dream work, a psychical force is operating, which on the one hand strips the elements which have a high psychical value of their intensity, and on the other hand, by means of overdetermination, creates from elements of low psychical value new values, which afterwards find the way into the dream content. If that is so, a transference and displacement of psychical intensities occurs in the process of dream formation, and it is a result of these that the differences between the dream content and that of the dream thoughts comes out. Okay, so the dream is the sort of working of your internal kind of conflict that's going on. So a dream is not just what you want. A dream is your mind. This, according to Freud, okay, a dream is not just what you want, it's your mind negotiating and arguing and kind of fighting over these different things. What you want, but you're also desire to follow the wishes of your father, on and on and on. And then you can interpret it as being a sort of story of the struggle of these different desires or unconscious needs going on in your mind. Okay? So what else does this type of analysis do? It allows you to reinterpret canonical texts. Okay, so before, you had a lot of very strong interpretations of the meaning of Hamlet, the meaning of Oedipus, or even for Freud, he would say the meaning of the Bible, right? And art, or many organized religions, and he would say that they represent something about being human, not just about those specific characters. So Oedipus is not about Oedipus, he would say. Oedipus is about the Oedipus complex, or how little boys want these things. Okay. So he would say this is his interpretation of Oedipus and why he uses the term Oedipus for what he calls the Oedipus complex. He says there is an unmistakable indication in the text of Sophocles' tragedy itself that the legend of Oedipus sprang from some primeval dream material. Okay, that's key. What lies beneath, right? What's primordial, what's deep inside, which had as its content the distressing disturbance of a child's relations to his parents owing to the first stirrings of sexuality. So he's saying that the story itself is about these kind of repressed desires that we feel inside. Okay? So you might think that, this is only true of, like something like the Oedipus story. But let's say you do an analysis of film noir in the 1950s. And you say, film noir in the 1950s is a reflection of the anxieties, of geopolitics and the Cold War and fears about nuclear holocaust or something like that. That would be a psychoanalytic interpretation, okay? So not just about specific characters, but about the general society and how in general society has this kind of fear that's hidden beneath. So even though the 50s were these kind of very boom times for the United States, where, people were suddenly making a lot of money, there was still this, fear and this kind of sense of danger and anxiety that was lying below the surface. And it's the popularity of film noir at the time reveals that kind of thing that's going on underneath. So that would be a psychoanalytic interpretation. A psychoanalytic interpretation. Okay? All right. So let's move on then. Okay, so now how would we use this on our text? How would we use this type of psychoanalytic interpretation? So I used we used Junot Diaz's short story, The Cheater's Guide to Love, but I think the entire book of short stories is really worth reading as a kind of overall text and a way of thinking about issues of childhood sexual abuse, issues of self-destructive behavior that kind of manifest throughout life, and in your romantic relations. So, if you get a chance, I recommend that you read the entire book. It's really great. As a story about someone who has all these kind of destructive behaviors where they keep ruining all their chances at romantic fulfillment and happiness because of these underlying and unresolved issues that are going on that are happening psychologically. So that's one way to think about it from a psychoanalytic perspective. Okay, that this character Junior, who's the kind of protagonist in these different stories, keeps self-destructing in these relationships with people that really love him, because he cannot kind of overcome these kinds of deep-seated psychological trauma. So these stories are about that. At the same time, you can also see it as an example of, if we want to take it one step back. So let's say our original kind of interested perspective was the perspective of how do you understand this character Junior? But you can also take a step back, and a lot of literary critics have done that, and say you can also see it from the perspective of the writer himself, Junot Diaz, as someone who is dealing with psychological trauma and using storytelling as a way of working through or processing that trauma. So, here's a Salon article where Junot Diaz talks about, how his stories come from his own trauma, and it was only very recently that he talks about, a lot of the suffering that he went through as a child, through childhood sexual abuse, and, a lot of his own mistakes. And you see it also, and this is important to note, that Junot Diaz was recently, I think in the last 3 years, he was accused of sexual harassment, I think. Kind of like as part of like the Me Too movement, and he tried to kind of like explain that away by saying like, oh, I've been the victim of childhood sexual abuse, so I do this kind of destructive behavior, but he's kind of been discredited in the public eye, because of these kind of things, and you could also from a sort of psychoanalytic perspective, you could say it's like, oh, Junot Diaz himself is an example of someone who, went through a lot of bad things, and then kind of because those bad things were never really kind of healed, he himself did bad things to other people, as something that kind of was repressed inside of him, so that's something to kind of think through. But at the same time, another way to think about it is writing itself as a process of working through, as kind of a healing that has to happen. Okay, so that's one perspective. Another perspective you can look at it too is from this idea of, the history of people from the Dominican Republic, are also all kind of haunted by this kind of trauma of their political situation, of living under the auspices of a dictator and also foreign interference. So there's different traumas on different levels going on here that can all be kind of psychoanalyzed and seen as in the text. So I'm going to leave that for you to kind of analyze. Maybe if some of you want to post in the forum and talk about, different kind of examples of, what's the word I'm looking for, of psychoanalytic readings you can do of the text, I welcome those. And I'd really like to hear back from you about, this lecture, any questions that you have, but also, your feelings or your thoughts and interpretations of the Junot Diaz short story. In a way, you could also see that your interpretations of the story can be its own form of psychoanalysis. What you find significant, what you find meaningful, can also be a representation of, what you might be feeling about the text or feeling in general and that kind of thing, or how it kind of resonates for you. I know that for me, a lot of Junot Diaz's work also resonates with me in terms of my own kind of psychological disposition as someone, who may have thought of himself, in certain ways, or, maybe did not deal with certain kind of childhood or psychological development issues that was later on reflected in his issues in romantic relationships. Okay? So, what Freud offers then is a sort of mode for interpreting that. It's not that he's right or wrong. It's just that he invented a tool for us to use. Okay? All right. So let's see. Do we need to recap? So yeah, just as a recap, right? There are different ways of interpreting stories. And every time you interpret a story, you're also basically retelling that story from a particular perspective using a tool that you use. Using a tool. Okay? So we went through different types of tools to use. We went in depth on one particular tool, that's psychoanalysis, and I hope that you can use that tool to try to understand the text that I ask you to read, but also maybe you can use it in your essays or when you're reading other texts, okay? And in future lectures, we'll talk about how this kind of idea of the psychoanalysis gets used not just for thinking about individuals or thinking just about sexual desire, but thinking about things like politics or economics, okay? So we'll talk more about that later. All right. Okay, so that's it. Thanks for sitting through. I know this is quite long, but I hope it was helpful. Please post any kind of questions, feedback, comments that you have in the forum so I can answer them. All right. Okay. Hope to see you soon. Take care. Wash your hands. Stay healthy. And hopefully see you in March. Okay, bye.